Farm broadcaster Max Armstrong here, leading a discussion over the next few minutes on early season weed control. There are so many things on the grower's plate right now, a number of challenges that have to be managed, and maybe coming into this harvest season, one of the last things you're thinking about is early season weed control. But we want to get that on your radar screen, get you thinking about that a little bit, especially as you move through the fields over the next few weeks in the combine. We have three panelists to carry on the discussion with us over the next few minutes. Dr. Aaron Hager, Associate Professor in the Department of Crop Sciences at the University of Illinois. Dr. Hager, welcome. Good to have you here.
Thank you, Max. Good to be with you.
Dr. Aaron Burns is on the campus of Michigan State University. Dr. Burns, an assistant professor in the Department of Plant, Soil, and Microbial Sciences there. Dr. Burns, how have you been this summer?
Doing good. Thanks for having me on.
Well, we appreciate you being a part of the discussion. And from Syngenta, Mark Kitt, Technical Product Lead in Herbicides for Syngenta. Let me start just talking a little bit on a local basis. Dr. Hager, there in the area that you serve, the growers in Illinois, what are some of the key weed concerns right now? And let me preface this by something just came to mind. I took a trip, must have been about 3 weeks ago. I went down 251. I decided to get off the interstate. So I went down through northern and central Illinois, down around Mendota, Winona, El Paso, down through there. I couldn't recall the weed control, and I know windshield inspections are dangerous, but I couldn't recall seeing such apparently effective weed control in those fields. They just looked absolutely great this summer.
We've actually had a fairly good season so far in terms of both crop growth and controlling the problematic weed species in both corn and soybean. Recent trip that I took across the center portion of the state really showed about 3 species that were pretty prevalent across a lot of soybean fields. Number one was the water hemp population. And then number two, a little surprising, quite a bit of velvet leaf sticking above the soybean canopy this year. And the third one would have been volunteer corn. So really across most of the central part of the state, those were about the 3 dominant species on the recent windshield tour that I did.
Was the volunteer corn kind of a product of the season we had in 2019? I mean, from the standpoint of all of the challenges that came along last year.
I think probably a part of it would be. I think there's some issues that we're going to have to face, I think, in some of our weed control programs in soybean with respect to some actual chemical antagonism with some of the tank mixes that we're using right now. But it's not an insurmountable challenge by any stretch of the imagination.
Dr. Burns, in your area that you serve and with your growers in Michigan, what have you seen?
Well, we have, the continued expansion of water hemp and Palmer amaranth. We've been lucky. We've been a little bit farther north and haven't had the same populations that some of our neighbors to the south have, but those are definitely expanding throughout our state and more water hemp, even into the central part of the state, which growers are battling. And then interestingly enough, we had a lot of velvet leaf breaks too. So that's interesting to hear that you guys have that also. I had growers across various different cropping systems, corn, soybean, potatoes, talking about velvet leaf this year. So that's an interesting finding. And then we're having some giant ragweed issues also, normally just kind of in ditch banks and things like that, but are, I think, invading more, especially into the cornfields, and got some questions along those lines. But given how, unfortunate the 2019 season was with all the prevent plant acres, they've done pretty well at battling those pretty high seed banks that were resulting from that.
Dr. Burns, your growers have had a lot of warning of this resistance problem coming their way. I mean, it's been talked about to the south, as you noted, for quite some time. They were pretty well prepared, were they not?
I think they were well prepared, and we're a pretty diverse state in our cropping system. So that diversity really lends a strong point into delaying that evolution of resistance. So we've learned from our neighbors, and then being a fairly diverse cropping system really helps out.
Mark, share with us some of your thoughts here overall as we look at this point of the growing season and how we did, from what we've seen thus far in the season.
Yeah, I'll echo a lot of what Dr. Hager and Dr. Burns have said, that, historically across the corn and soybean belt, and even this year, we're seeing weed challenges with water hemp, Palmer amaranth, giant ragweed. Not only the resistance issues, having multiple modes of action that these weeds are resistant to, it's challenging, and to make sure that we're using effective modes of action on these weed species.
How are you seeing the evolution going? I mean, Dr. Hager, you've watched the resistance challenge here developing. How does it seem to be evolving? Are you seeing it changing season to season, for example?
Historically, Max, we first documented target site-based resistance to ALS inhibitors clear back in the early to mid 1990s. And our program at the University of Illinois for many, many years focused pretty intently on identifying and understanding these target site-based resistance mechanisms. But that's changed in about the last 5 to 10 years. And instead of looking now at more target site resistance, what our group is really focusing on is trying to better understand this quote unquote new phenomenon of non-target site or metabolic herbicide resistance. And this is very concerning, because when we talk about metabolic resistance, then a lot of what we used to know about target site resistance may or may not really come into play. So when we look at populations of weeds, especially in the amaranthus, the water hemps, the Palmer amaranths, for example, we've actually documented instances now of a population of water hemp that is resistant to a class of herbicides that the farm records would show were never sprayed on that population. And so the predictability that we have when we get into these instances of metabolic resistance, unfortunately, right now, is quite low.
It's a moving target, then, isn't it?
It can be. And unfortunately, again, unless a farmer has done pretty extensive screening, which most are not capable of doing, or if they have some collaborative work with a university scientist, we really don't know what still remains effective in many of these populations ahead of time.
Mark and Dr. Burns, please weigh in here. I should have encouraged you at the outset to just interact with each other, because I think you might think of something along the way that you want to add. So please do so if you'd like to.
Yeah, I think Dr. Hager brings up a really good point, that using residual herbicides with overlapping effective modes of action help control some of these repopulations that Dr. Hager is referring to. Making sure you have, products like Acuron that have 3 modes of action, 4 active ingredients for that residual control, and length of residual control in corn to control these resistant weeds and to protect yield.
Right, agreed. On the non-target site resistance, that is a resistance that multiple groups are working on, and we're learning more. But that is a unique beast in itself, being able to be potentially resistant to herbicides that population hasn't been experienced or exposed to yet. So that is an alarming thing to learn about, and then trying to just understand those unknowns and how we manage those populations differently than traditional target site.
Dr. Burns, what kind of yield impact has there been in the inability to control some of the early season weeds? What have you seen? Has it been measurable from the standpoint of bushel loss, for example?
So we know that early season weeds, so weeds that germinate, before corn at the same time of corn, are the most competitive. They're there throughout the entire season and really can rob that early season yield by, competing for those nutrients right away, right off the bat. So, if you have total failures, you can see up to 50%, yield loss, but, typical can be more in the 20%-ish range. But that's even if you do have an effective, post control afterwards. But that early stage, V4 to V6, that yield is pretty important.
What about the change that we've seen toward adjusting planting dates a little bit? I guess it comes to mind. One thing I think about is the fact that we had so many more growers trying to put in soybeans early this year, and many of them were in fact able to do so. How did that adjust the equation?
I mean, I think it's just making sure that you keep in mind, what what's been planted and when, and what herbicide you planned on using, and if you can apply that in the window that's still safe to make that application. So there's wide ranges of herbicides and labels that you can visit and look at to make sure that that fits into your overall program. So if you're planting soybeans early and need to get those in, that you choose herbicides that fit that overall diversity that you have.
Dr. Hager, share some of your thoughts on what you've seen in terms of yield impact with the inability sometimes, if the producer isn't effectively controlling those really resistant, troublesome weeds.
I think for many, many years, the success of the Roundup Ready soybean really moved a lot of growers to a total post system. And when the Roundup Ready corn first came out, a lot of people tried that total post concept, but not very many of them did it 2 years in a row. Because again, as Dr. Burns has indicated, the early season competition of weeds with corn can be very, very devastating to corn yield. And the one way I try to present this is that I've never done anything in the 27 years that I've been at Illinois to ever increase any grower's output by 1 bushel. That's not what I do. We're in the yield preservation business. So in other words, it's the breeders who put the yield potential into the crops, into the corn, the soybean, the cotton, the canola, etc. And the only thing that weeds really do is try to compete with that crop for the exact same resources that the crop needs to reach and express that genetic yield potential. And so by eliminating those competing plants that we have dubbed as weeds, we really allow the crop then to access all the available resources and then give it every opportunity to maximize that genetic yield potential, whatever it may be in that season. So early season control in corn is of utmost importance in terms of trying to achieve reaching that genetic yield potential.
Mark, you want to share some comments in this regard, and also what you've seen in terms of where there's been an inability or lack of effectiveness in controlling some of these problem weeds? What have you seen in the big picture, if you would, Mark?
Yeah, I think it's worth reiterating that growers need to remember that weeds compete with the crop for light, nutrients, and water, right? Just as Dr. Hager said, that we're preserving the yield and using effective residual products, as Dr. Hager said. I think growers have started to move toward that, to use products like Acuron that are putting more residuals in the soil to protect that corn yield. In fact, quite a bit of the university university research that we have used to promote Acuron shows that we can actually preserve yield up to 15 bushels per acre more than even some of the competitive products that don't probably have that length of residual control.
One thing that we are seeing, of course, is producers are watching their expenses so closely when you have commodity prices where they are, and maybe there is an inclination to try to cut back, save a little bit here, save some there. I'd like for you to share some thoughts about that. Dr. Hager, what are you seeing in the growers that you consult with?
Well, certainly the price tag of weed control is first and foremost on a lot of growers' minds, as it probably justifiably should be. The way that we try to paint this picture, so to speak, is that every farm operation has at least 2 columns on a spreadsheet. You have your expenditure column and you have your revenue column. And obviously, I think many farmers would like to reduce that expenditure column as much as possible. It makes good economic sense. But when it comes to weeds, you can still reduce that input of herbicides or weed management programs. But just keep in mind that that column is directly linked to your revenue column. And so while you may want to try to reduce your herbicide cost or your weed control cost, you can. But there will come a point where another incremental decrease in your expenditures to manage these species, these weeds that compete with the crop, you're going to affect your revenue column also. Now, you may not be able to measure a 5% yield loss in the field. You may not see an 8% yield loss. You may harvest 235 bushel corn and think, boy, that was a pretty good yield, but it could have been 245. It could have been 250. That's the subtle nature sometimes of how the weeds will get into your pocketbook, even though you don't really see it in terms of that lost yield bushel. And, think about this not only just in one season, but what happens if you lose 5% every year? What happens if you lose 8% every season? So it can add up over time if you're not watching what you're doing.
That cumulative effect could be significant, couldn't it?
Can be.
Dr. Burns, share with us some of your thoughts. What you share with growers when they talk about saving a dime in terms of their crop protection products?
Yeah, just to echo what Aaron said about revenue and how that can add up quite quickly, and then also when we're thinking about maybe switching up our herbicide programs and not using maybe as effective or wanting to put out as many applications, lots of times that can lead to more applications. So if we're cutting rates and we don't get that effective weed control early on, we might have to be doing more post applications than we want to and things like that. So I think overall we might have poor weed control resulting from some of those decisions that then have added costs when you have to go back in to clean up some of those issues. So that's something often that we don't think about also.
That's a great point. The inability or the lack of attentiveness to controlling those early season weeds could wind up resulting in an even greater expenditure, you're saying?
Yeah, sometimes if we're seeing some of those breaks that might not have been observed if we had some effective multiple effective sites of action out early, you might have to go in and make another application or have a more long-term impacts on end of season yield.
Mark, I bet this is a discussion you have often when you're around growers, isn't it? About the most effective expenditures and yet the most effective weed control. How do you balance that out?
Yeah, a lot of times I take the conversation for growers to, they think about weed control. Weed control to me indicates a short-term mindset about weeds. They should think more of it as weed management. So weed control, you're just thinking about controlling the weed at the time. Weed management thinks about it a little more long-term, not only what we talked about previously on using excellent residual herbicides like Acuron to protect that yield, but not only for the sustainability of the land long-term as well too. Because if you're not managing weeds within the crop, you start increasing the soil seed bank. And even after harvest, you want to make sure that you're controlling weeds in that field so you have a clean field next year and you're preserving it for future generations.
So cutting application rates, Mark, that can be certainly short-sighted in the long term. It could really make a difference, obviously, to the bottom line.
Yeah, that's correct. And I think Dr. Hager and Dr. Burns would agree with me that, cutting rates is not the way to go in this current environment with the amount of resistant weeds that we have to protect yield and to maximize farm profits.
So weed control is not something to skimp on. I'm sure that's a message you share often, Mark. Obviously, that's your business.
Yes, that's our business. And we're really proud of the products that Syngenta delivers to the grower, and especially Acuron. It's one of the premier residual products on the market and provides excellent value for the grower.
We've talked about this a little bit earlier, but in terms of the weed competing with corn, with that corn plant, share a little more insight on that, if you would, Dr. Hager, just how that actually happens. I mean, I think farmers know it, but maybe a little bit of a refresher on this would be good for us to focus on a little closer.
Well, one way you can think of it is that, again, these weeds, as we designate them in the field, are simply their other plants. And their requirements for growth and development and reproduction in many instances are quite similar to the needs and requirements of the corn or the soybean or the cotton crop. So again, it's resource allocation, competition for these resources. There's been work that's been published that shows even how plants perceive each other in the field. There could be subtle differences in the quality of the sunlight in a weedy environment or in a weedy field compared with a weed-free field. So many different avenues of interference or competition between weeds and crops, none of which, again, I've never seen a published paper that shows that having weeds in the field has ever increased yield. It's a one-way relationship, and the only thing that they do is they'll decrease that yield potential every time.
And not just robbing sunlight and water, but other resources too?
Well, you can also factor in harvest difficulties. Anybody in the northern part of Illinois who has a species called burr cucumber in corn knows how difficult it can be to actually harvest a cornfield that's been overrun with burr cucumber. So
Sure.
a lot of different ways. The key really in the long term is we're going to continue to use a lot of different herbicides in our corn crop and our soybean crop, etc. But I think in addition to using herbicides, we need to really change the focus on what else can we do to help ensure that by the end of the growing season, there's no weed seed that's added back into that seed bank. My predecessor, Dr. McGlamory, had an old adage. He used to say that 1 year's seeding equals 7 years of weeding. And so those few plants that maybe you allowed to escape this year, yeah, perhaps they didn't have that big of an effect on your yield overall. But if they're adding seed back into that seed bank, now you may be forced to address this challenge to actually increase your expenditures for years into the future. Whereas if we took the time to try to eliminate any of these survivors, we really haven't increased that soil seed bank. And the other good thing about not adding any seed at the end of the year with respect to herbicide resistance, if there's no seed, there's no change in allelic frequency, and that's a win.
Aaron, I think I can remember Marshall sharing that 1-to-7 ratio in an interview on some occasion. I can still hear his voice. I'm glad you invoked his name.
Yeah.
Dr. Burns, is there anything you'd like to share in that regard?
Not a lot to add. That was a great, capture, and just, short-term and long-term goals. So long-term goals being seed bank depletion and how important that is overall is just paramount. So sometimes we think about weeds as just yield robbing for that season, but that's just one, small piece to the puzzle overall in targeting that weed seed bank, which unfortunately, as you mentioned, can stick around for a long time, and depending on what weeds are there, multiple years.
Mark, do you have anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, I'll add a little bit of what Dr. Hager said about, I think his quote was, never had having any weeds in the field is a good thing. But there's actually been some research in Canada that talks about when any weed emerges in a field, it can irreversibly damage the corn plant and not maximize its yield potential. So not even letting the weeds come up in the field is an excellent weed management strategy in this current environment, as we alluded to earlier, with weed resistance, not adding weed seeds to the soil seed bank. It's just a very important practice, even in these tough economic times.
Well, what are your best agronomic weed management recommendations for corn growers looking to start clean and stay clean for 2021? How about a quick summary here? Mark, starting off with you.
Yeah, so we would recommend, obviously, Acuron, which I mentioned earlier, utilizing that and putting a 2/3 rate down pre, followed by a 1/3 rate post-emergence to obviously start clean, clean up any small weeds that may be emerge in the field after that initial application. And as we discussed earlier, it's one of the broadest spectrum, longest lasting herbicides on the market. And our research has shown that, we can protect yield versus competitive products up to that 5 to 15 bushel per acre mark. So it really provides excellent value to the grower.
Dr. Burns?
I think just the first step is finishing 2020 strong, so ensuring that we're not going to move weed seeds around to fields that maybe don't have those infestations yet. And then looking at when you're harvesting or doing late season scouting, what are your weed breaks? So how can you design your 2021 program to target the breaks you had this year? So using this fall as an opportunity to evaluate what those are, and then take this winter to do some research and go to different events and learn about what management would be optimal based on the weeds that are in your field.
Dr. Burns, you talk about making sure not to move that seed from one field to another. It takes a little housekeeping, doesn't it?
It does, and it can be difficult with sizes of fields and just just the time management and strain that goes into growers in the fall, and the millions of things they need to be doing, but just keeping in mind that those weed seeds are small and they can move around, and then you're going to spread the problem.
The hierarchy of things that the grower is tackling at harvest, I suspect that one doesn't come very high on the radar screen, but maybe it should. Then, huh, Dr. Burns?
Yeah, just one more of those things to keep in mind and put on the plate of the growers when they're doing those operations.
Dr. Hager, some comments you might offer in that regard?
Really, I think Dr. Burns hit the nail on the head. It really starts this fall with, the combine platform. That's your last scouting trip across the field usually to see what worked, what didn't work. Take the time while it's still fresh in your mind as soon as you can. Maybe it's the day you sit down for Thanksgiving to reflect back on what you saw from the combine platform this fall. Did everything look good? Did we have some escapes? Where were the escapes? Can you map those out? Can you remember where they were? And then plan ahead, obviously, for next year to try to come up with a very solid weed management program. Start it off, early in the season as you can, as conditions would allow. Start clean. They'll never plant into an existing stand of winter annuals or summer annuals. And then just keep managing throughout the year. There's really no one size fits all approach. Every field is subtly different. I joke with a lot of growers sometime, and I ask them, what do we call this large expansive area where we put these huge pieces of equipment and plant this terribly expensive seed? And they look at me kind of quizzically, and well, they're fields, right? And I said, well, they are. We call them fields. But remember, these are all biological systems. And biological systems, by definition, they're never static. They're always changing. They're changing in response to what we're doing in these fields. So whatever, again, that we can do to try to disrupt the life cycle of these summer annual species, again, whether it's effective herbicides, multiple effective herbicides, multiple applications for the growing season, again, trying to shift our focus not just on what we spray, but what else do we do to try to ensure that by the time that we harvest in 2021 season, that there's no weed seed being produced.
Would anyone like to add anything else before we wrap up our discussion? You've had some great points that you've made, and I really appreciate the kinds of thoughts that you've shared here. Mark, Dr. Burns, Dr. Hager, anything else that we haven't touched on that we should?
I would just like to reiterate to the growers or producers out there to continue to think about, it's more about weed management than weed control. Thinking about the long-term implications of controlling weeds, not adding to that soil seed bank, preserving the land for future generations, those type of things, and to make sure they're using, whether it's Acuron or not, a very strong residual product in both corn and soybeans to start clean. And we appreciate the business from all the Syngenta customers.
Very good. Mark, Dr. Burns, Dr. Hager, thank you so much. A real treat to share the time with you over the past few minutes. Hopefully we've elevated a little bit higher on the producer's radar screen among the matters that really matter, effective weed control, how it can indeed have a substantial impact on the bottom line. Sure appreciate all three of you. You all had some great contributions. Thanks for joining us here.
Thank you, Max.
Thanks.